So I'm going to look at a general theory for understanding non-compliance and compliance behaviours. And in my presentation, I aim to provide you with some insight into what has drawn me into this subject and in some of the history of theory development about compliance behaviour before proposing the approach that I'm taking. I've not included any references in my presentation as they are all in the written paper. And my guests on this slide remind me that we're talking about real people and real livelihoods. Compliance is a big issue for some regional councils. It is a significant financial burden on ratepayers, and it can be very disruptive in some communities. So I suggest that if we know more about how and why people become non-compliant in the first place, maybe we can reduce some of these effects. Leading towards preparing this paper, I had a number of things that came together. I just published a journal paper that provided policymakers with a review of the main human behaviour models for understanding and predicting behaviour change. And then I had a couple of my farmer clients come to me with concerns about complying with their consent conditions under the One Plan. When I read the published papers that were guiding the thinking on compliance, I found that the literature was very fragmented, and it seemed to be mainly produced by policy analysts and lawyers rather than economists, sociologists, social psychologists, and agriculturalists. So that situation inspired me to do a bit more research on the subject. Beginning in the 60s, I found that early research on compliance stressed that people were more likely to comply when the benefits to them from doing so were expected to be greater than the costs. In practice, though, it has been found that people generally feel they have a moral duty to obey the government, unless there's a good reason not to, or they incur extremely high costs from doing so. Now that means that the cost-benefit approaches have underestimated the actual levels of compliance being achieved in practice. A later theory focused on deterrence. It considered that if people fear the threat of punishment or the social opprobrium of being made an example, and if their fear is greater than the feelings of personal and social security, they will be compliant. However, when the level of punishment does not match the apparent consequences of the infringement, or when non-compliance occurs inadvertently but still gets punished, it can lead to a general focus on rule minimization and cover-ups. In other words, the focus becomes one on avoiding the punishment rather than applying the regulations to achieve the desired policy outcomes. People have also looked at education as a compliance intervention, seeking to encourage compliance through persuasion and advice. If people want to respond and have the ability and resources to respond, then this approach can work well. However, if the existing behaviours are well entrenched and there's not enough time and resources for people to respond to education interventions, this approach may not be adequate either. So in practice, all of these approaches to understanding non-compliant and compliance behaviours have had some success. The biggest limitation for policy implementation is designing the compliance mechanism to fit all people and all situations. Problems result when regulators appear to be too tough or when they appear to be too lax. Now, there's two recent approaches addressing these limitations. To try and better match the heterogeneity of the situations when they are deployed, recent enforcement models have taken a more adaptive and cooperative approach. Responsive regulation enforcement approaches begin with education, and then if that is not responded to in time, the regulator works iteratively towards imposing administrative sanctions, and then if that's not responded to, they apply more emphatic punishments. Smart regulation approaches build on the responsive regulation approach, but do so cooperatively by engaging other third-party agencies and applying surrogate sanctions. For example, in potential cases of animal welfare, They involve vets and federated farmers in the enforcement process. And there are milk companies that do not pick up the milk of farmers that appear non-compliant with environmental rules. To be effective, these two strategies require the regulatory and enforcement agencies to understand the motivations of potentially non-compliant parties and be able to build positive relationships with them. I suggest that we can draw on recent theories from sociology and social psychology to better understand non-compliance. And instead of escalating our enforcement situations from education to punishment, look at going the other way, from the threat of punishment to using less aggressive mechanisms. In the model I'm about to describe, I've drawn on three current theories about the origins of non-compliant behaviour. And I'll now go through the three components of the model that I'm proposing in my paper. In motivation crowding theory, people have intrinsic or extrinsic motivations to comply with regulations, and often they have a mix of both of them. Extrinsic motivations provide sufficient rewards or punishments to make compliance the best rational option for people to choose. Intrinsic motivations are generally high if the regulator and the target group have a constructive working relationship and the regulations that are being developed have been done so cooperatively, encouraging people to respond out of feelings of citizenship, duty, and fairness. Now, the nature of regulations can strengthen or weaken people's intrinsic motivations to comply. When people initially have a strong intrinsic motivation to comply, the introduction of a regulation with extrinsic compliance mechanism substitutes for some of their intrinsic motivation. This could be by paying people who follow the rules or adding financial penalties for non-compliance. These external motivations may actually have the effect of increasing non-compliance rather than decreasing it if they have a relatively large influence, but are still insufficient to completely substitute for the intrinsic motivation that has been replaced. Rather than introducing external motivations, people's intrinsic motivation to comply with new regulations can be stimulated and enhanced through things such as through promoting people's sense of civic responsibility and their sense of duty to their community. And my example is the 4 Million Careful Owners campaign that was held, the central government initiated in the early 2000s. Now, with social alignment, people will generally tend to behave as if there is an underlying social contract between themselves and the government. When governments appear credible and other citizens are being obedient, people will try and meet their state-defined obligations. However, over time, the different life experiences that people have with government agencies can result in them having different levels of trust and willingness to comply with government regulations. People can generally cope with a lack of distributional fairness, everybody being treated the same, when there's been a process of procedural fairness. In other words, they've all been involved. However, when procedural and distributive fairness are both lacking, people no longer trust the regulator. Enforcement practices can exacerbate this. Too little enforcement has been found not to provide people with enough assurance about the behaviour of others, whereas too much enforcement, picking up accidental and inadvertent non-compliance, adversely affects people's perception of procedural fairness, and so undermines an initial alignment in the social contract of obligation with the regulator. An example of this is the recent protest when hunters felt that the cull of tar by DOC was affecting their livelihoods and that they hadn't been involved enough in DOC's process.
10 minutes.
The greater the gap between how the regulators expect people to behave and people's actual beliefs, attitudes, and behavioural preferences, then the greater the dissonance and amount of stress that this can cause them. Despite that gap, when a regulator is trusted and people have confidence in the general purpose for a required behaviour, they will try to comply with the regulations. However, when they don't, they can become difficult across a couple of dimensions. They may have feelings of being oppressed, leading them towards becoming less cooperative or resisting the new regulations. They may try to undermine the regulations, seeking ways of regaining personal control and asserting individual independence from the regulatory authority. In contrast, they may think more morally about the issue. They may decide to accept the regulations, rationalise acceptance of their strictures, and become cooperative with the regulator. Or they may be committed to the overall purpose of the regulations and try to go further to achieve the desired outcomes. When the majority of people in a community consider that a new regulation incorporates behaviours that are already commonplace within their community and that it has been procedurally fair, they're likely to accept the regulation and support its implementation. They're also likely to support enforcement for encouraging compliance amongst the recalcitrant people around them. As an example, the 50 Shades of Green protests, when people felt that their way of life was being undermined by government policy. Their local economy was being reduced, the future of their schools was at risk, and that they were not being listened to. They had a degree of personal dissonance between their preferences and what was happening in the communities, and they protested about it. If we can develop policies that build intrinsic motivation to comply, that strengthen relationships of trust between citizens and regulatory authorities, and that reduce the sources of personal dissonance, I suggest that we will minimise non-compliance and the costs upon society of enforcement processes. Maybe my best example is the government's approach to human health policy and COVID-19. In particular, three of its elements. Policy motivation. The message that we all had to unite in a team of 5 million and appeal to our intrinsic motivations to be good citizens. The social alignment. The government placed all arrivals in quarantine with limited exceptions, and when it became an issue, they stepped up enforcement. Given a choice between that and privately run facilities, we've shown that we trusted the government. Personal dissonance. Lockdown was not a threatening process or experience. The list of rules was kept to a minimum, although all of us probably broke one or more of them at some time. Financial support was provided, and although they could have applied more draconian measures, as much as possible, the police took an educational approach to managing the lockdowns. There were only 400 arrests during lockdown level 4 across the whole of New Zealand, and until recently there was none in Auckland during lockdown level 4. So in conclusion, assuming that compliance is just about financial incentives, deterrence, or even education, does not provide the level of understanding needed for responsive and smart regulations. But recognising that policies with intrinsic appeal, social alignment, and low levels of personal dissonance will result in greater compliance and reduce the burden on councils and other enforcement agencies. Thank you.